So in the Easter season here, we should celebrate Jesus' resurrection once a year on the Passover, which was a type of Jesus becoming the sacrifice during the Passover, and rising on the wave sheaf offering day, first day after the Sabbath. Absolutely, we should celebrate that once a year, just like they celebrated the Passover once a year, in remembering that Jesus rose from the dead, which is our faith. So what is the interpretation of the Lord's Day? There's 5 different pretty common interpretations. One is that it's talking about the Sabbath. Another one is it's talking about Sunday, the day that Jesus rose from the dead, according to the 99% of people who believe in Jesus. Some people argue that he rose on Sabbath, but that's hard for me to buy. And I look at the way the text presents it, it seems like, well, it is talking about, at times, it may be talking about the Sabbath during the Passover. I think there's several different lines of evidence. I've talked about it in the past. Never mind that. Friday to Sunday is 3 consecutive days on which Jesus was dead. So on the 3rd day, after 3 days, how do we make those work? They're seemingly contradictory, but it can't be on the 3rd day very well and be consistent with on the 3rd day if you make it too particular and say making it 72 hours or usually people don't go that far. They'll say 3, since it says 3 days and 3 nights. They'll say it has to be 3 daylight portions and 3 night portions, but I don't even think that's necessary. Although there's a better case to be made for that way of looking at it, since it does say those words. I don't think it has to be that specific, because that's still problematic for when he died, what portion of the day and night cycle on the day which he died. And then if you make it 3 evening portions and 3 night portions, he rises in the day or the dark portion of the day, the 24-hour period after the Sabbath ends. And so you end up getting more than 3 days and 3 nights. And it's very particular that his body doesn't see corruption. So when you put all those things together, I think it's not actually a problem that he dies on Friday and raises on the day after the Sabbath. Say it that way. He raises during the day, which is a 24-hour period after the Sabbath 24-hour period has ended. So he's dead on all 3 days in a row. And it's just hard to imagine that could get messed up so early when everyone is talking about him raising on the day after the Sabbath in the church and whatnot. So the interpretations would be the Sunday, the Sabbath, but then more popular interpretation would be John was saying, I was in the Spirit on the day of the Lord, meaning the millennium. And the early church believed premillennialism was the early church view, because all millennialism, it has to be read onto the text. It's not actually exegeted from the text, and even millennialists have admitted this. But I don't blame them for not necessarily accepting premillennialism when there's so many people that had weird beliefs and really kooky ideas. So they were just kind of like fell back on that, unfortunately, because they depend on Augustine too much, who came up with a lot of bad ideas that are still prevalent in the church. But so we also have people who think it was Easter. It's talking about Easter, the day of the Lord. The Lord's day is the day he rose. But so you read into it like Sunday was a new Sabbath or something stupid like that, which doesn't exist except for in your mind if you want to read that into the text from the early church fathers. Just how you're going to look at the implications of that and what do you think? And then you're going to read that into the text. The question is, what does the Bible say is the Lord's Day? If Jesus is one with his Father and he's not going to break the Father's law during his ministry, which he sends to the nations to be taught, he didn't send Paul's twisted message that people believe to the nations. He sent his message of what he taught, and what he taught was under the old covenant. So how are you going to deal with that? Of course, my Hebrew roots friends are going to say I'm breaking that, but I don't agree. And I've tried to make that clear why I think that makes sense from the text. Nobody thinks the entire Mosaic covenant, as is in the text, can be something we're supposed to do. If you believe that, you're not a Christian, because a Christian is a new covenant, or is the thing that Jesus ratified, okay? Whether you call it a renewed covenant or a new covenant. So how do you make that work? Well, I don't think you can make it work by thinking he did away with any of the 10 commandments, because they're listed, and we're told if you break one, you've broken them all, and then the 10 commandments are listed. So, and the Sabbath is a moral command, which I demonstrated in my last video, explained that. And it was afforded to all people, and it was invented at creation for all people before there was even sin in the world. So if Adam and Eve didn't sin, there would still be a weekly Sabbath. It wasn't a reaction looking forward to the work of the Messiah, who's redeeming sinners from their sin, which already suggests that there's a law of some kind that defines what sin is before God starts implementing any, when he implements the sacrificial system after the fact and gives the prophecy of the seed of the woman. And of course, the festivals are implemented in Israel because the Messiah would come forth and accomplish certain things during those feasts, during the year, his last year, including his death and resurrection and the sending of the Holy Spirit correlates with those things because they were looking to the fullness of God's plan of salvation to call back all the nations. But regarding the Lord's Day, we have many interpretations. This weekly Sabbath, the new Sabbath, apparently, Sunday, or Easter, or it's an eschatological day of the Lord. Why think it's the day of the Lord? Well, because the seventh day is the day which is called the Lord's in the Bible, first off. And then second, this phrase is mentioned here, okay, in the context of the book of Revelation, which is looking to the end of history. So look at what it says here. I don't think this is an unreasonable interpretation. Only people who want to read their Sunday into it can't see this. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, saith the Lord, which is and was and is to come. And then this is a message to the churches, which has prophetic historical application, as well as the message to the original church. This describes the history of the Christian church through the 7 churches here. Just, you can look that up. It's really interesting. It describes the progression of the church through history in the different eras. The last one being Laodicea, who thinks it's in need of nothing and it's covered in Abraham's sauce, but it's really blind, miserable, and naked and wretched. Generally speaking, that seems to be the case. It makes sense too, because look at there's many things you can look at. He talks about Jezebel is right in the right period of the Roman apostasy. And Jezebel is like the harlot woman, which is defining like the church from Daniel, that idea. Because she's fornicating with other gods and the doctrines of Babylon. And if you're a Protestant and you don't agree with that, I don't know, you're totally out of, need to go back to school on that. Even if you're not an Adventist, all the Protestants agreed that she was the harlot church. That's why that's one of the 2 pillars of the Reformation. That the Pope is the Antichrist, the harlot church of prophecy. And of course, they hadn't been developed, and that's what the Adventist church did. It developed that, made sense of it, including understanding who Michael is. Because he's the Prince of the Covenant, all the covenants, always was God's plan from the foundation of the world. And if you believe that the Son of Covenant typed Jesus in, and then he comes and fulfills it, and he brings the fullness of God's plan to call back all the nations, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? That he's the Passover lamb and he's the atoning sacrifice for Yahweh. And he's the first fruits of them that slept. And then he sends the Holy Spirit, which he promised during his ministry that he would send after he ascended. And then sure enough, that happens, doesn't it? On the appropriate time, right? 7 Sabbaths or whatever after his resurrection, whatever it is, 50 days later. Pentecost. But this is just couched in that. And so if this is talking about the end, he's the beginning, the middle, and the end, it seems like it would have application to being the day of the Lord, or the 1,000-year period, which correlates to the 7th millennium. And this is seen in the early church fathers talking about that idea. It's in the Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermes. This is mentioned. They mentioned this idea of 6,000 years in the early church. They saw that idea. And of course, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. So the day that is the Lord's, it's specific in particular. It doesn't call the weekly Sabbath the Sabbath of the Jews, but the New Testament will talk about the festival of the Jews, because of course Christians are writing about the Gospels after the fact, well after the New Covenant's instantiated. So they talk about this Sunday being the day after the Sabbath, and they record that Jesus says he's Lord of the Sabbath because he invented it. And in the Old Testament, it's the day that's the Lord's Sabbath. It's the day which is called the Lord takes possession of, because in it he rested from all what he created and made. It's his day. It's the Lord's day. And of course, we find out Jesus is the Lord who's one with the Father. And so the context of Revelation that John's writing about is looking to the end things. So I would guess that it has double application. I think it's talking about the Sabbath and then has a kind of like a play on the idea of it being the millennium. But it could also be, if it is talking about the resurrection of Jesus, which isn't far-fetched, you could say it's talking about Easter, not a weekly. Why would they keep it every week as the Lord's Day? Every single week, always? And then also on Passover, Sabbath? So it's like they celebrate Jesus' resurrection because it correlates with the Passover once per year, but then also every week. Why would they do that? I don't think that came from the church or the teaching of the apostles, if that is even the case. I think that was just a particular belief that some people had in some regions. But the fact of the matter is, the law stands. And if you're not keeping the Sabbath, which is the Lord's day, because he made it, and he calls it his day, and it's the only day he calls his day explicitly in the text, but you're free to believe whatever you need to believe to support your non-biblical doctrines. But I'm going to go with the Bible. Happy Lord's Day, and I'll be celebrating the resurrection of Jesus this Sunday with you. God bless.